Hello and welcome to the Connectology podcast. Here, Road Night Taylor's influential team of elite connection specialists and their expert guests help you to better understand distribution and transmission network connections and how to acquire them faster, for less cost and at lower risk.
Good morning, welcome to Road Night Taylor's Grid News and Views and our first filmed podcast in Road Night Taylor's new office space. It's lovely to be joined by Kyle, Nikki and Philip. Say hi, guys.
Hi.
Hello.
And I think probably no surprises, sort of top of the agenda today is connections reform. So we're very lucky because we've got Kyle, who has been tirelessly sitting on probably far too many working groups, industry meetings with Renewable UK as well. Kyle, are you able to give us a bit of an update as to where we are now with connections reform and on the CUSC Mods in particular, CMP434 and 435?
Absolutely. It's been a really busy summer. Lots going on, and in particular the consultation, the working group consultation that was open for a week and a half. Really quite short time frame, lots of various elements, as they were called, looking at various different parts of the proposed reform process. But it's just a bit of a reminder, so we're talking about CMP434, and that is effectively the changes to the connection process that would be looking forward at any new applicants. And then 435 is how it would then be retrospectively applied to those that are already contracted in the queue. So after the consultation ended, there were about 82 formal responses that were non-confidential and about another 7 that were submitted as confidential. So quite a lot of material.
So almost 90 responses.
Almost 90 responses.
And actually, that's quite, just like put that in context.
Yeah.
Like the average CUSC mod gets about 5 from some really keen geeks. Yeah, okay. Yeah.
And while not every response was complete, you didn't have to respond to every single question, I would say the vast majority covered almost everything.
Wow.
So a huge array of responses and some quite different views, different starting points. So some really agreed that change was necessary, but because each element was quite large in terms of its content, the detail was really important. So that's where the working group is at now, trying to go through that detail. In contrast, in addition to that almost 90, there was another 69, plus another 7 confidential, so about another 80 responses that came in for 435. So
Was there an indication of what kind of stakeholders they were? Because I know a lot of industry groups would have responded on behalf of several.
Yes.
Several groups.
Yeah.
Was it a lot of individuals? Was it a lot of industry groups? Was it quite mixed?
It was mixed. I would say there were certainly a couple of key industry groups that submitted, and then those that are already in the working group, either working group members or observers. But in the good news, there were quite a considerable number of responses from smaller organisations that aren't necessarily represented in the working group as well. So some of the focus has been over the last few weeks, 2 weeks, has been to try to focus in on some of those kind of key points that maybe haven't come up because we've not been able to discuss them in the working group.
And DNOs did respond as well, and have been represented in the working group as well.
Absolutely.
So
And the TOs as well.
Yeah.
Responded to.
But I think most people would agree that the current system isn't necessarily working. There's maybe a few outliners who sit in quite a pretty situation that don't want to reverse it. But I think for most parties, they agree that the current system isn't optimal. Yeah. But obviously the bit that no one agrees with is how to fix it and how to fix it in a way that's quickly without being too detrimental on certain key parties.
Yeah, it's a really good point in terms of time frame. So some were very much of the idea that there's a lot of material still to be developed and that we're therefore not ready. So looking at some sort of delay in implementation. Others said, well, irrespective of the detail, we need to change now. So what the ESO are proposing is a bit of a happy medium to some extent, where it's recognised there's a lot to get through. It's not realistic to assume that all that could be prepared and put forward to the authority, within the next month or so. So there's an expectation that implementation would likely be extended out to not January 2025 as was initially proposed. Exactly when is open for a bit of conversation at the moment, but we're expecting it probably would be the early spring, given the kind of indication at the moment. But I say, changing all the time. So that's one that we'll keep everybody up to date on. In terms of just this week, the working group were discussing some proposed changes, so some quite significant changes from the original proposal. And I think, some of the kind of key aspects where there was a lot of maybe disagreement or quite varied views have either been removed completely to try and simplify the process. But what the working group are trying to do now is understand what the unintended consequences of those are. Any proposal is quite linked. So therefore removing one aspect, such as the long stop date or DFTC being removed from the proposal, that has an implication on the wider process. So moving DFTC, for example, then there's the question of, well, how does it work for small and medium embedded customers in particular? So that's where the working group is at now, trying to now get into that detail of, well, what's the unintended consequence and how to best resolve it. So I'm not going to go through and run through every single kind of change point, but I think the main thing there, highlighted a couple of points that, or a couple of elements that have been removed, but also that Gate 1 is effectively now going to be optional. So that's a big shift where if you go down the Gate 1 route, it would be based upon a desktop study, and therefore similar maybe to a budget estimate, you get a D&O level. And if you're wanting to go to Gate 2, you could do so effectively without going through Gate 1. So quite a change there. The other big change would be around the milestone requirements kind of post reaching Gate 2. So when do you have to have submitted planning by? And that's been what a lot of feedback was given based on the various different planning types, and the timing now has been adjusted kind of in line with the responses that came back. So we do actually have a little bit of an updated calculator that should be going on the website next week. So that has taken into account those changes. So if you are interested in detail and want to look at your project specifically, then we can certainly direct you to that through the bottom of the podcast.
Is that going to be technology specific planning as well? I know there's obviously has to be some consideration around, larger technologies like nuclear, offshore wind, etc. I think there was some talk about that being considered in those milestones.
Yeah, so initially in the working group conversations did include nuclear, offshore, they separated them out. In the consultation, it just focused on specifically planning types, so town and country planning, DCO, Section 36, etc. What's been proposed now is those building blocks are still there in terms of planning, but they have segregated out nuclear, offshore wind, and emerging technologies.
Okay.
So emerging technologies, it would be a case-by-case basis, so they're leaving it open where it's bilaterally negotiated effectively. The starting point would be maybe more in line with the planning type, but it gives the option for that to be negotiated. Same with nuclear, and offshore wind is 5 years.
Okay.
So they have tried to cater for both without being too specific on technology.
So it sounds like, effectively, there's actually been a bit of a relaxation of the requirement to go into planning, or relatively quickly after getting to Gate 2. And I suppose that we probably expect that there will be a certain amount of pushback or perhaps scrutiny of that within the industry to say, does connections reform sort of do anything? If it's too easy to, if Gate 2 is just land rights, is it effective enough at cutting the queue?
No, it's a very good point, because if you consider, just taking a few examples and run them through the calculator, actually the milestones you'd be getting now under the proposal might be later dates.
More generous
than you'd be getting under the milestones introduced under 376. Not in all cases, but in some, and therefore, once the working group get into that level of detail, which, as I said, the proposal was only walked through with the working group just this week. So over the next few weeks, as we get into that detail, there may be, as you say, quite a bit of pushback and subject to kind of further change. But this is the initial change that the ESO has proposed based on the first round of response reviews.
Ultimately, they're balancing a very fine line between connection reform has to be effective. It has to remove parties from the queue that are not looking like they're going to make sufficient progress, which is then slowing up other projects. But as a result, I'm a little bit concerned at the moment that even though there's all the talk about the first ready, first to connect, there are some people who are going ahead and getting planning on projects that they don't have a valid connection offer for at the moment, with the hope that first ready, first connect ends up coming through.
Mhm.
I haven't yet seen anything that makes it look like that will be an advantage, and that will then result in someone coming through, which then kind of feels like there's a bit of a mixed message coming out there in terms of, at a high level, first ready to connect, first to connect. But in the connections reform at the moment, it doesn't really look like there'd be any reordering of the queue based on that.
It's definitely something that has been discussed, and there are 19 alternatives. Now, they're not alternatives to the full process, they're alternatives to specific elements. But that's only 19 that were raised through the consultation process or had already been put forward. There's still plenty of opportunity for the working group members to raise alternatives, and that is one that they're discussing as well, of whether there's maybe another measure brought in. So if you are sitting actually ready to move, how can you best move forward? Project designation was mentioned as one mechanism, but again, the detail isn't yet drafted, and I think that's the challenge. The concept may be there, but it could easily get lost if it's not included in the detail.
And one thing just to ask in terms of bay sharing, that's one of the aspects that's come out as part of connections reform. Has there been any significant update on that, which then also could unlock the ability for more people to connect closer to where they're geographically located and allow slightly more risk element to be going on? Because obviously it's easy to say as a GB wide, we're going to assume that a certain percentage of projects won't end up connecting at a GB level. It's much more difficult at a specific substation to say, I'm only going to presume half the projects are going to connect, and then all of those ones there actually go through and connect, and then you're left looking pretty awkward.
So there is a bit of an update on that, in that the ESO have published a paper, or at least drafted a paper, on a bay sharing policy, which is quite progressive. It looks at customers being able to opt into bay sharing. So effectively, that could look like two customers banking a connection into a single circuit breaker, with the TO extending their ownership boundary. So effectively, the TO was adopting that shared circuit breaker and potentially building out to the two sites, or having more of a sort of switching arrangement where use of disconnectors would allow two customers to use the same bay, and the ownership boundary to be at the end of that bay. So there is some good sort of detailed work that's been worked up there. I think one thing to be really clear on is that quite a lot of the initiatives that are coming out of connections reform are great ideas, but they're not yet at a stage where someone can sort of put their hand up and say, I'd like that to be applied to my specific project. The idea is these will be options that are available for consideration when projects meet Gate 2. So as part of the kind of Gate 2 reoffer that parties will get, they will include things like, bay sharing opportunities. So looks good at the moment, but I think we've yet to see it implemented for anyone.
But also to add, the latest news looks like all GIS switchgear is going to end up being owned by the TO anyway. So effectively, it means that some of the AIS solutions will end up having a connection boundary, which then more aligns to where we think the GIS switchgear is going to go to for transmission connections anyway.
Yes, so this is probably worth explaining to people, Philip, like that this is where the TO, so NGET, for example, have come out and said where they're building an entire new substation, and that's a new GIS board, and rather than individual customers coming in and having multiple contractors working under their own sort of CDM regulations and so on at a site, the TO's taken a fairly unprecedented step of saying, nope, we're not going to give you the choice. We are going to build this board as connection assets for you. The customer will still pay for them, but you won't have the option of delivering them as user works. And that's kind of quite a new policy statement, really, that's been made in the last few months.
And which people are going to start seeing mod apps to their previous offer where they didn't have that scenario. They opted that they were going to own the circuit breaker, to now effectively reverse that and saying you don't have the option at this point. You have to go back to a default. And like you say, it does make sense, especially on new build sites where it seems crazy for NGET to install a board and then for someone else to come to a brand new board, the same manufacturer, and bolt the same piece of switchgear onto there. It just doesn't make sense.
I completely agree. I think it's a really sensible, pragmatic decision, and hopefully helps with some of the supply chain constraints. You haven't got 5 parties trying to engage with the same supplier for one board. So really support that. Okay, so I think other couple of things. Whilst we're on sort of connections reform, there has been an update in terms of the transitional arrangements to kind of ease us into the connections reform space. So as we're recording this, yesterday, the ESA made an announcement to say that the Ofgem have approved the concept of a transitional arrangement. So new applications going into the ESO will now effectively get a kind of indicative Gate 1 style offer. So we're expecting that to look quite similar to some of the Step 1 offers that people got as part of the kind of Transmission Works review, two-step process in England and Wales. So, there'd be no study work being done by the TO. You're not really getting a queue position. You're just getting a kind of very indicative holding offer that you would sign and accept, no securities. But then it would be, once the connections reform sort of TMA4 plus process has been implemented, you would then be able to get a firm offer once you met Gate 2, or be able to get a detailed offer once you met Gate 2. I suppose, Kyle, just sort of thinking to that time delay issue, because I suppose we were kind of thinking, right, well, if connections reform is implemented in January 2025, I think on the original sort of timescales, the first kind of Gate 2 offers would come out sort of Q3, Q4 2025. Yeah. I guess there's a real risk now, actually, that people, new applicants going into the ESO for new transmission connections, might be stuck with that holding offer for a really long time. That they won't get a Gate 2 offer until end of 2025 at the earliest.
I think so. I think they're going to be in the situation where reviews will be done early 2026, and obviously that's for any new applicant, whether it's generation, demand, storage.
It doesn't include, so just to be really clear, the ESO is planning on holding some webinars towards the end of August, so probably about the time this goes out, which will cover this in more detail. But this is just brand new applications. So if you're modifying an existing scheme, if you're a DNO submitting a project progression, those are still allowed to go ahead and you will get proper offers. But any new applicants into the ESO should be very aware of that.
I think it's one of those things that I think probably broadly across the industry, people would admit that there's quite a lot of generation schemes already in the queue, that the queue already looks quite bloated. So I think from a generation perspective, that makes sense.
I don't think we've been advising people submit new applications for quite some time.
Agreed. I think there's a few very sort of unique arrangements where they could, but they're very few and far between. For me, where it may become slightly more awkward is the very national significant demand type applications that needs to go through, potentially in some of the areas where actually the demand is part of the transition to the lower carbon economy and ultimately going to be soaking up the renewables in terms of going through. And then that looks like it could end up being a fairly major blocker. So that would be my own personal view, is that on the whole, fairly supportive of that. It gives them time, it allows them to go through and focus. But for a few niche projects, it feels like it might be the wrong thing of doing. Personal view.
Yeah, it's a really good point. I think if we're thinking about, those large demands that will be really quite significant, the timeframes, whether you're looking at like HAR rounds for hydrogen, for example, it's something that just since the announcement, I have been kind of looking into how those HAR rounds match up with that time frame. And therefore, if you're looking at going forward for kind of HAR 3 or particularly kind of HAR 4, then actually you might be in a position now where you're not going to have clarity on your offer. So how does that need to inform the HAR process? I think, again, it's just marrying these two up and understanding that if the connection process is resulting in a bit of a kind of delayed or extended time frame before you've got a kind of clear view of exactly where you're going to be connected and whether your project's viable, is going to have quite a significance over the next couple of years on what can realistically go forward and be funded. So
I think also even, let's say Elon decides he wants to put a new gigafactory in the UK. It's one of those things of then you look at it and you go, well, actually, I'm going to have absolutely no visibility on where I can connect a project for several years, potentially going into a part of the network where there are no demand restrictions for final demand. If you consider batteries as we think they are as being flexible assets and not being studied, that to me is an element that it does need a little bit of a niche carved out for very key projects that could be very significant to the GB economy.
I suppose that's where, that strategic spatial energy planning thing might come in anyway, because there is a bit more focus coming in on that. We've got the RESPs coming in, like the regional energy strategic planners, and also looking at sort of what technologies we need in certain areas. So that will be in terms of like generation and demand. Yet to see the sort of the detail of that, but I think that'll be really interesting, seeing how that interacts with the planning system. and also how that interacts with sort of grid and spatial energy planning and how that all comes together.
And Nikki, how do you think this sort of impacts or like sheds any light on what central government actually want to do? So Labour, coming in with their sort of, fairly, they've got pretty big ambitions in terms of decarbonising the electricity sector, but renewable energy ambitions in general. So, and I think you're our go-to person when we always ask about sort of the public policy realm.
Labour's like big plan at the moment is GB Energy. So this has come out of an idea of them wanting to invest in the private energy sector. It could be a really positive thing. Equally could be quite challenging. It could potentially replace private investment. It's a little light on detail at the moment, but the idea is that Labour, as a government, as like taxpayers, will invest in and sort of kickstart certain technologies while also supporting mature ones. The sort of kickstarter technologies are going to be sort of tidal, which I'm a fan of. So if anyone wants to do any tidal, please let me know. And sort of floating offshore wind and like green hydrogen. And then also sort of supporting like the existing industries that we have, so sort of offshore wind, solar, batteries, etc. We've got this sort of strapline of like a clean energy economy by 2030. The word sort of clean, low carbon, renewable are kind of banded around like they're all the same thing, and they're not really. But I think the idea is that we don't have any fossil fuels by 2030. Certainly not that we don't have any nuclear or batteries or anything. But the idea of Labour investing in the energy sector, I think, is a really interesting one, because I'm not sure there's a lack of investment. I think there's a lack of resources. I think there's a lack of infrastructure, but I don't think there's a lack of investment. So I'm not sure that it's the kind of energy placed in the right way.
One of the things that there could be more of is probably more big picture strategy. There's obviously some big picture strategy in terms of the regional, in terms of zones of saying this part of England should have this much solar and how much going through. I wish it would go deeper and more strategic. This is a demand growth area, so therefore we should be doubling the infrastructure in this area, which would also facilitate renewables, and therefore we're going to go right the way down to the 33 kV level and invest in this because it's needed before 2030, 2040, and therefore that's the right thing of doing and tying everything together, looking at demand and generation and what's needed for electrification of vehicles and heating and future industrial commercial demands. It's kind of that level of strategy still feels a bit piecemeal from what I see at the moment and the future plans. Where there is strategic thinking, it's very high level. And every time I ask and go, well, why aren't you doing this? And it's like, well, the strategy stops at that level, one level too high. And that's where I hope in the future we'll get to of going
in the spatial strategic energy plans.
A bit deeper, a bit more focused on the broader level. So we end up doing the right thing in the right area based on minded to position of going, it feels like a good idea that this could double in the future. And therefore it's a good investment for generation and hydrogen and flexibility and future demand. And then you can see a long-term picture. I just don't see that at the moment.
And I think that's because there isn't really that appreciation that the transition needs to be at all voltage levels.
Yeah.
Literally from LV through to 11, 33, 132 transmission. It's very easy for governments to focus on transmission lines, A, because they're quite controversial, and B, because they're very visible. It's sort of the whole rewiring Britain agenda that they have currently. It's very easy to focus on transmission lines, but what we actually need is like you said, sort of preemptive investment in all voltage levels.
Quick one for you, Nikki, if I may. So everything, recently that's come out has mentioned 2030 quite a lot. What are your thoughts, given that, in a couple of months' time, a few months' time, we're going to be only 5 years away? Does that feel still kind of achievable?
No, I think 2030 is not realistic, and that's kind of okay, because
set an ambition and then maybe you deliver a few years later.
We always need diversity in an energy system, and especially at the moment, we still need that, and get away from gas completely until we're actually ready to do that.
So it's all setting the scene then for 2030 is by 2030 we're already on the journey.
Yeah,
than
we should be making an effort to do it, and we are. There's a huge amount of investment going into the energy system, But it needs to be, like kind of as Philip said, it does need to be the right technologies in the right places.
Nikki, that probably cues us up really well for the kind of going full circle back to connections reform. We've talked about whether or not, connections reform maybe does or doesn't go far enough. I think we wanted to do a shout out to sort of Ofgem. Jack Priest-Abbott does a blog on sort of connections reform and Ofgem's kind of wider takings on this. They've published a recent blog saying that they think they would like the ESO to consider further measures that include things like checks that we are not setting up connections reform to facilitate perhaps solar and storage onshore, and make it easy for them and make it much harder for other technologies. So they have introduced the idea of whether there might need to be some form of cap on generation specific types. So when you get to gate 2, it might be capped based on some form of technology limit. And I think they've also suggested that there might need to be other considerations like financial commitments. So, Philip, I mean, from your perspective, do those kind of additional measures, which are quite separate to really what's been proposed so far in connections reform under the consultation, do they kind of help, do you think, go a bit further, have a bit more impetus?
I think they do. My personal view is I think it's probably trying to do it in the wrong way. I mean, I think connections reform just needs to do what it was initially set out to do, which is make the bar high enough in a sensible way that sensible projects that have a good chance of going through can go through and develop. The challenge that I have with technology caps is I came from a background where I ran a system planning team. I always had a 5 gigawatts worth of queue of projects that were coming through, and the churn rate of those projects were phenomenal. Do I think the same's going to happen today that it did 8 years ago? No, I think more projects will actually go through and get built out. But if you cap a project at a certain number, you are not going to get that number through actually constructed. So that will be the first thing that I'd say in terms of going through and making sure that you don't say, that's the number that we expect to get connected. And I hear it from DNOs all the time. We've got this amount of gigawatts of battery storage. We don't need any more. And I tell them that not that amount of gigawatts will actually get built out. Mm-hmm. There is a huge amount of hurdles that every project has to get through before it reaches financial close and it's committed in terms of construction. Going back to the financial measures, it's difficult. I like the fact that there is a lot of opportunity for one-man bands to come in and develop projects, primarily because they tend to do it quite well. And if you take really big energy companies they also can do it very well, but a lot of them tend to move quite slower. If we see at the moment, there's a lot of small companies that's come in, that's developed portfolios of projects, and now parties coming through are buying those companies or those projects and then building them out in terms of going through. I would be wary of restricting that pipeline, because if you introduce really hard financial measures, you may well be stopping those parties who have developed some really good projects. If you look at the ones that have just got 3 big transmission projects, solar ones, that have got planning recently, they have come from small outfits who have developed them that if you would have looked retrospectively, probably wouldn't have met the barrier to entry. So I'd just be wary about sort of unintended consequences of potentially slowing down the development by saying only companies with a bank balance of a certain amount or only people that can do these projects have to put £1 million into a project in escrow. It might end up stifling some of the early projects had it been done retrospectively.
And I think I'm quite concerned about the mechanism by which we would introduce any of those additional measures. And Kyle, you're very close to the real kind of the actual CUSC kind of process. And obviously this is a little bit outside that.
Yeah, because it's one of the reasons, well, when Gate 1 was still a considered mandatory requirement as part of the original discussion, there was the concept of a holding fee. So you wouldn't have securities and liabilities at Gate 1 because you wouldn't necessarily know what you were securing against. There'd be some sort of holding fee. And that was then removed and replaced with the idea of a long stop date. So instead of being financial, it was, essentially trying to raise the bar so that you could only sit at Gate 1 for 3 years. Now, with Gate 1 no longer mandatory, the long stop date therefore isn't relevant and has been removed. But the reason the holding fee was removed in the first place, a few reasons, but one of the challenges was what are you ultimately paying that for? Because at the moment, under the code, everything that
it's sort of cost reflective.
It's cost reflective, yes, exactly. Yeah. You're putting securities down on a particular asset that you're securitizing against. It's a fee for a particular piece of work, like an application fee. So how can
I think I might challenge whether or not application fees are cost effective.
Quality versus cost.
But there's something associated with it, either a kind of physical asset or a process. Whereas if you're now putting into place a holding fee that's based on either it's the same for every project or based on tech or capacity, however it happens to be kind of laid out, it's again not directly linked to anything.
Though we do have for the securities and liabilities geeks, we do have pre-trigger liability thresholds, which are pounds per megawatt, which are not cost reflective of anything.
If you fix.
Yeah, if you fix, yes.
Yeah.
I mean, I think there again, it's kind of, at the moment, I think part of the challenge of why we find ourselves in somewhat of a pickle is because transmission has done things in a very different way to distribution. So in distribution queues, there is acceptances of when it's coming through, and there are people who can accept very long-term transmission projects with actual liabilities, with zero fees, and people fall off their chair when I tell them that they can accept a gigawatt project with no deposit that's coming through for some, and other projects that are extremely unfair because it happens to have a specific piece of work that's very advanced.
That's been triggered by another party.
It's being delivered regardless, and therefore they have to put down £100 million worth of securities for some work that's going ahead anyway. So partly, I think we find ourselves it's a very unfair system at the moment, and potentially good projects are being penalised and not able to go through, and other projects that may not be so good, that have long connection dates, can accept with no sort of financial commitment. I mean, I think there needs to be a well thought out plan which considers securities for projects which at the moment are completely unfair. They're even more unfair for people that are final demand customers who have to securitize against everything that's been gone through, the infrastructure, non-infrastructure sites, the nearest MITS nodes, depending on whether it's what the naming convention is. The whole system is very archaic and evolved over time, and I think it needs to have a relook over securities, holding fees, and look at something that's going to be beneficial for GB Worldwide itself and the projects, and to get us to where we are. And at the moment, I think people are looking at bits of it, but not considering the wider picture. That's my view anyway.
I reckon a separate podcast on that. And Philip also gets a prize for name. Maybe this could be Grid News and Views. Are we in a pickle? I suspect that is all we have got time for. So thank you very much, guys, for joining us. And we will see you on the next Grid News and Views.
Cheers.
Thanks everyone.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you for taking your precious time to listen to this episode. Now, not everyone is ready to have a connectologist in their life. For others, it's just too expensive. And as our team is so small, we do have to be very selective in what work we take on. And that's why we put so much effort into these shows. We want our society to have the equitable energy system it needs in order to decarbonise and to thrive. So we want to help to topple as many connections barriers as we possibly can, in spite of our size. So please do feel free to ping a link to this episode to anyone you know who might be interested, because it would mean so much to everyone.